Welcome. Welcome to Pacific Unitarian Universalist Church. This is July 5th, Independence weekend. I've been a minister for 17 years and training for a few more. I've been, of course, church life has a certain number of events that knock things off the calendar. I was living in Chicago when 9/11 happened. Of course, everything on your day timer went off to something else. But nearly in 2 days, decades of being a minister, nothing has scratched off the topics like we've had with COVID-19, and then following that up with the Black Lives Matter movement, started, initially by the death of George Floyd. Went back to pandemics, Black Lives Matter, race issues. Today we focus on the second of those and the most promising of them all. But I'd like to call this a sermon on the things that were unfinished from the civil rights movement. And our offertory this Sunday will be 50%. We're going to do a split plate with the LA Black Lives Matter group and their work focused on peaceful protests and raising consciousness of institutional racism and promoting policy changes, and let's do our part to contribute to that. So your capacity to look at that is on the web, and we have momentum, and let's not spoil that. Here are a few announcements just to kill the momentum. We have a 1 o'clock call, which sort of become a race-based call. I think this is Vivian's call. She'll be up here in just a second. Today's topic is on white fragility. On Tuesday, there's an 11 o'clock Zoom call with me. I'm going away for about a month, going home to see family I haven't been able to see in 6 months. And but I'm going to be available by the phone, and I'm going to be on those 11 o'clock Tuesday Zoom calls. We also have on July 16th, which is coming up not too far away, there's a book called The Other Westmore that our book group is reading. They're meeting on Thursday morning, July 16th at 9:30. You can check into that on the website, pacificunitarian.org. If you like to be on our newsletter and just been watching our services, please send Gabby a note at admin@pacificunitarian.org. If you want to leave her a message there, you can get on our newsletter and find out all the things that are going on, but also check the website too, pacificunitarian.org. I missed saying it last week. It's a candle of joy. 5 years ago and 9 days from today, DOMA passed. I was in San Francisco at the time, and that's sorry to pass on that last week, but that was mentioned. And we're going to have a new members ceremony. We haven't been gathering since early March. We had one planned for April. We've got Amy Fan and Val and Marcelo Palacios, Dave Stewart, and Jeff Ludkin as new members. We might even have more by then, but we're going to do a ceremony, whether it's via Zoom or whether it's live. We're not really clear about that yet. The Interfaith Committee for, the South Coast Interfaith Council, which I'm a member of, is showing a powerful film called Just Mercy at 3 o'clock this afternoon. You can check onto their website, South Coast Interfaith Council. If you want to watch that movie, there's going to be a collective watch to that. And I think that's enough. I want to invite up one of our most loyal members, Vivian Howe's going to read our chalice words, and I'm going to light our chalice.
Our reading today is by Deanna Vandiver. We'd like this chalice, a symbol of our faith, alive in this world, naming our vision of collective liberation and daring to be with one another in our beloved community.
We would be one as now we join in singing our hymn of love to pledge ourselves anew to the high call.
I'd like to invite all our young, down to the front of the computer screen, I guess you'd say. And if your family or you watching it haven't lit the chalice, you can do that. I'm going to lead for us a story called If a Bus Could Talk, and Vivian's going to flip our pages for us. It's a story of Rosa Parks. Probably all of us are familiar with it, but this is a nice little book. So, If a Bus Could Talk, the story of Rosa Parks by Faith Ringgold. A girl named Marcy got on a bus that looked strange to her. The bus didn't have a driver. The people on the bus, who seemed to know her name, asked her to move. She had sat down in a very special seat, reserved once a year for Rosa Parks. The people wanted to explain Rosa Parks to her, and they began. Rosa Parks was a young African-American girl from a simple family of farmers in Alabama. She grew up in a time when the Ku Klux Klan would ride around at night and burn houses, hurt and scare black people that they didn't like. Occasionally, she had to sleep in her clothes for fear of having to be run so quickly. Rosa learned from her family to be proud and would defend herself, which was a good but a scary thing at the time. When she went to school, she had 50 to 60 kids in her class. It was a time of segregation. Because they were black schools, they were only open for 5 months. Rosa decided then that she wanted to be a teacher and make a difference. But she had to put some of her dreams on hold because of a family illness, and she worked as a seamstress at a local department store. One of the days, Rosa was mistreated. Even though she paid her fare, she was left behind by the bus driver. She came to hate the way that black people had to sit on the back of the bus and be treated as second-class citizens. Eventually, Rosa Parks grew up and was married to a light-skinned black man who got her involved in city kids issues and also the local NAACP, where she became the secretary. It was there that she did her first activist events on social justice and voter registration. The most famous thing Rosa Parks ever did was on December 1st, 1955. She refused to get up on the bus and out of the white section. For that, she got arrested. And the people on the bus explained to Marcy that the seat that she sat on was actually set aside for Rosa Parks because she had sat on it. Rosa eventually got bailed out by the NAACP, and this moment when she sat down is arguably the start of the modern civil rights movement. After Rosa Parks sat down, the leadership of the NAACP got in touch with Martin Luther King, who was a young pastor, and he became the leader of the bus boycott, and much, much more. But for 381 days, the black people of the Montgomery, Alabama town skipped the bus and, of course, paid for it, and buses were nearly empty for more than a year. During the boycott, Martin Luther King got his house bombed for his efforts to desegregate the South. The bus boycott led to other ideas of protesting inequality, like lunch counters here, where black people were not allowed to sit. I invite you kids to think about how that would make you feel. And I think about how embarrassing it is for me and for most white people today. Not all, but most. At that time, white people thought they were better than black people, and they wouldn't let them even use the swimming pool or the same bathroom. All this while, Rosa Parks' case, whether she was right or wrong about sitting in the white section of the bus, was still undecided and went to the Supreme Court, where the bus segregation was considered illegal. Still, Rosa got fired. That it was not illegal and still happens a lot today, even if it is illegal. She had her life threatened enough in Montgomery that she felt like she had to move, and she moved to Detroit to work for a black congressman named John Conyers, famous in his own right. She was a leader in community service. Rosa was famous and honored, but she was discriminated against as a woman and rarely asked to speak. Rosa, hearing about Martin Luther King, who she got to know, got shot, and here we see her crying with her mom. Rosa Parks is most famous for one simple, kind, courageous act. You are part of a church, kids, that more than most is out looking for wrongs to be unwronged, for doing things that are unfair, and we try to change them. I hope you dedicate a part of your life to that call. I hope you try to be kind and courageous in ways that you think can make a difference. That will be what it is to be a good Unitarian Universalist out on into the future. Thank you. So we shift gears here now to just think, I'm going to light a candle of joy and concern for all those concerns that remain unsaid because we can't be together. It is our tradition that people come up and just light a candle and share what's going on, good or bad, in their lives. So I'll light that candle. So we have a number of folks in the church who are suffering from health issues. One of our most loyal members is just got a battery of tests to figure out what's going on. We have Rodney Oakes, who you might know plays the horns and in the choir. He's just had a valve replacement and a pacemaker put in. We think about Maurice, who's got a lot of family issues going on, and we think about all those folks out there who are struggling. And it's also one of our top chef, Margot's birthday, who's right out there on the patio, sitting quietly listening to us. So we think about that, and I want to share a prayer from Bruce Southworth. Find a still spot. Maybe close your eyes. O creative spirit of life in which we live and move and have our being, we give thanks for all of nature's bounties. We give thanks for caring friends, compassionate neighbors. We give thanks for the communion of those who seek to serve others. Each of us carries private griefs and burdens every day. Sometimes we can share these and for open hearts and those moments where we find a listener, we are grateful. Sometimes the world bears heavily upon us and we feel like we struggle alone. We search the depth for healing, for renewed hope, for strength which gives us grace and peace. May we be strengthened in the efforts to be of service and reach our highest calling. May we always be mindful of the lives that are filled with privilege and success and the joys that are foreclosed on by many. May our prayer be that we always see clearly and keep before us the commandment to care and to be inclusive, to be open, not narrow. On this day and every day, may we give thanks, but let us also be dissatisfied as a world with its better part waiting to be realized. May our spirits and bodies be nourished and nurtured as we give thanks and praise for all that sustains us and holds us and all we deem holy. Amen.
Good morning. You're probably familiar with the chameleon. You know, the kind of lizard that changes its color when it's trying to camouflage itself from predators or to signal its moods, like anger against a rival or a desire to mate. Did you know there's another kind of chameleon, the human kind, defined by the dictionary as a person who changes his or her beliefs and behavior in order to succeed? Well, I have a confession. I'm a chameleon, both kinds. Sometimes I'm a white person, or at least afforded honorary white status by virtue of my education, my class, my English fluency, and my familiarity with Western culture. I can fit in, pass most of the time. I feel comfortable in an all-white boardroom or in an all-white church congregation on Sunday morning. By and large, members of my community, the Asian American community, are known as the model minority. We are non-threatening, we study hard, we work hard, and by some standards, we out-white the whites. As a group, we get higher SAT scores, and our average household income is higher than white households. But at other times, I change color. Sometimes I'm a person of color, a minority, someone who stands out in a crowd. I'm different in appearance. I have a different background and even a worldview that's different than most of yours. I've been a token person of color most of my life in far too many instances. For instance, I've been asked to join boards of directors or organizations because I make them diverse. And actually, I'm a twofer. I'm a minority and I'm a woman. I feel that I'm also sometimes a perpetual foreigner who can never be a non-hyphenated American. No matter how many generations removed from my foreign-born ancestors, my loyalty to the US flag and this country are sometimes suspect. Remember what happened to US citizens of Japanese descent during World War II? Or more recently, the Asian bashing as a result of the COVID virus originating in China. I've tried to make sense of this racial code switching. Over the past 20 years, I've studied seriously the issues of race, racism, using books, blogs, YouTube videos, and any resource I can to educate myself. I've participated in and led a number of anti-racism workshops, including those for the UUA and some here. I've tried to educate myself about this issue because it's something that affects me every day. And yet my academic knowledge and even my experiences do not prepare me to understand the Black experience. I've never had to tell my son not to wear a hoodie or not to put his hands in his pocket, lest people think he has a weapon or drugs. I don't live in perpetual fear of law enforcement. And I've never been told, you'll never succeed, you'll never graduate from school, you'll never get anywhere in life because of your color. But this is the common experience of many people of color, especially Black men in our society. And white people, well, sometimes they don't get it. White people make the rules. White people have almost all the seats of power in our nation. White people set the standards for meritocracy and fairness. White people write the laws and interpret them. They tell us what's legal and who's legal. White people write the history books. Most of them are teaching our children, and they have the majority of wealth in this country. White men have been on top of the racial hierarchy in the United States since the founding of this country by white, upper-class, land-owning slave holders. Today, we live with that legacy. We live with the legacy, and we have blood on our hands. The murder of George Floyd and many others and the ensuing protests are a direct, predictable result of that legacy. Despite all our lip service about equality and freedom for all, things have not changed all that much. Racism, institutional racism, is an iceberg. We try to chip away at the top of it, but many of us don't see the huge block of ice that lies underneath the surface. That is the legacy of slavery, of Jim Crow, of police brutality, of mass incarceration, of redlining, failed urban schools. And that's what has led us to today. That's why people who've been systematically oppressed, subjugated, and killed because of their color are up in arms. And I know many of you have joined them in these massive protests. And remember that chameleon, the lizard that changes its color? Try this. Try this out if you are willing. Try to imagine that you are a person of color. Try to imagine what it would feel like. And then try on the second definition of chameleon, the one that says you can change your beliefs and your behavior in order to achieve success. You can also change your behavior and beliefs in order to achieve racial justice. So I challenge you, be a chameleon. Be a chameleon for equal opportunity, for justice for all. Be a chameleon for racial justice.
Thank you, Vivian. Nice job. So you get a twofer today. Wow. You get Vivian and you get myself. I've rarely written a faster sermon than this one, and I'll preach it fast because I have a lot to say, but it also needs to have a certain energy and a pulse to it. I had something of what you might call a come to Jesus moment a little bit more than a week ago. I had, of course, as all of us had, been disgusted by the callous and cavalier nature of Floyd's death, but had been caught off guard and wondered if maybe the response was a bit hyperbolic. A few bad cops. I'd always believed that the struggles faced by black people were more rooted in economic status and poverty than in their racial status. In short, I believed that America looked more racist than it was because blacks were disproportionately poor, and America is hard on its poor, a hard place to be poor. I now believe I was wrong. I didn't believe that because I didn't believe there wasn't racism. Of course there's racism. I think our president is a racist, and I suppose that the solid 25% of our country that backs him is racist too. I'm aware of my own inner racism, more fears of being around groups of younger black men than white, aware of the stereotypes that filled my head and occasionally my heart, always aware that I'd, fought them off, but at the same time they never really went away. What I hadn't believed, quite simply, because I just hadn't examined the subject with as much detail as I did recently, was the depth and scope of it. Like many white Americans, I generally believed that what was often thought of as racism was more or less limited to, the N-word, Confederate flags. In a way, I thought racism was that, and then it was a cause of economics. In a way, I was right. Racism has a largely economic quality to it. I've always known they were intertwined. I knew that. What I was shielded from, like many of us, was the hard news that inequality is driven by a shallow and a deep and a hard and a quiet and a polite way that the world is anti-black, and white people are anti-black. And the way it passively works mixes in with indifference to means that it doesn't change very much. I have, to a degree over the last 10 days, bathed in the news and analysis that structural racism and how it works in a way I really hadn't before. I'm only a novice, really, but I've become to pull what were disparate pieces together. I don't think I've ever been more grateful to have a sermon to prepare my thoughts and to gather them together. 10 days ago, I believe that it was economic inequality and class and cultural priorities that conspired to create a world that looked more racist than it actually was. I've come to flip that opinion over. I believe our society is actually more racist than it appears, at least to white people. The idea that white people miss that race is actually a latent and persistent and unmentionable force is in our societies, according to Robin DiAngelo, who's the author of White Fragility, of which this theme of the sermon is set, is not novel. The fact that I miss that is intentional in a beautifully conspiring, passive way. She explores in her book, White Fragility, that it's a persistent pattern for white people, particularly people who identify themselves as liberal or progressive, to believe that racism is minus a few bad pockets down south, a few good old boy antics, something mostly behind us. We're taught to think that way. Like many well-intentioned white Americans, I had believed passively, and I've come to know quite conveniently, that the idea of racism was behind us as a view that kept my conscience deftly protected from a deeper truth of how pervasive and how accumulative racism at the systematic level is. I've come to accept the embarrassing news that my desire to see myself as relatively colorblind had a benign intention, but really kind of a cancerous impact. I never doubted black people faced economic or cultural hurdles that I hadn't and wouldn't. Never doubted that. Obviously, that's true. What I hadn't realized was how much and how many of those barriers are built upon a racism that I think is described as unconscious and mostly, even more than that, unexamined. I realized, as a New York Times author described it, I was one of those Americans holding an unyielding belief in a positive attitude that was essentially impervious to the facts. In order to gather the truth, I've written out a sermon-sized version of our history. I did a deep dive, but that's for another day. Today is more about the emotional and psychological nature of whiteness, as DiAngelo explores it. I'll summarize what, in my view, now this way: when you start to add up the opportunity costs for a career advancement, the fact that black educated students have even statistically less opportunity than white people with high school educations, I didn't know that. And from redlining away from more securable, affordable loans, I knew that was a problem. I hadn't quite considered the loss of wealth that was never accumulated. I knew it, I didn't know it quite as poignantly. When you start to argue the other side of it, that it's not racism, which I did for a long time, that it was economic, it was racism, but it was mostly the poverty that was the problem. You realize that it doesn't make sense without white people having a fear of, and a quiet resentment and a meanness towards black and blackness. You can't deny it's racism when you look at a history that refused to give slaves who had built up the land's value any portion of their own sweat equity back. They got nothing. At the same time, 3 years later, for 60 years, we gave away in 160-acre chunks to 1.5 million white people the land that was the West. You can't answer that or explain that without a pervasive racism being there. I wasn't won over to this argument by emotion. I was won over by, at least I believe, the facts. It's time to engage a more emotional and personal side of racism. And DiAngelo's strength is just that. White Fragility is a book that tears at your own sort of infrastructure that defends yourself. She makes you look at how blacks have been brutalized, isolated from wealth accumulation, and ostracized. But most of what she's done is make us look at ourselves. The book, in very concept, White Fragility, jabs and tears at the innocence we feel about race as white people. It asks poignant questions about how many real relationships you have with black people. How many do I really have with black people? Not many. And it proposes that the language you use to distinguish good from bad in terms of schools is really just more or less about black and white, way more than we're willing to admit. We hide our racism in comfortable language. White Fragility, in her book, proposes that white people's passive, clean-handed, polite, entitled racism, boldly and unsettling as it is actually much more impactful than those with the N-word at the edge of their tongue and running around with Confederate flags. How dare she say that? Well, she does, and I've come to agree. I didn't enjoy this book, which is why I'm glad I read it. Robin talks about how everyone has an opinion about race, and I had mine, and she was right, and Vivian and Tara have been right in our debates that we've had. I confused my opinion as being one that was informed. It really wasn't. Partially informed, not fully. Robin speaks about how remarkably ill-informed Americans are and how confident they are of their opinions, white Americans, and how that ignorance is quietly, subtly, but intentionally built upon a very understandable resistance to feel the truth. As Tara and Vivian can attest, I had lots of uninformed opinions that were shielding me in insidious ways that were built on a kind politeness, affable Steve. Me, we, you. The problem? The problem. In Rough Sketches, Robin suggests white fragility is born of a resistance of the pervasive, persistent nature of racism. We live with a resistance born of shame and an ignorance of how little the civil rights victories did to change things. Most of the economic statistics alone have African Americans and black people at the same place they were in the late 50s. DiAngelo challenges the likes of us, her target audience in this book, for what practically has been a dominant historical position, and asks us what we have done to change that. Practically, the answer is almost nothing, and sometimes even less than that. It's first nothing, followed by a more painful realization of the power that all of our intentions have on maintaining the status quo. DiAngelo lays out that white privilege has given us the privilege to remain ignorant about how the default position that white isn't its own sociological perspective and place. DiAngelo argues that living just below the surface of this politeness that we generally have, that anything that we don't believe that there's much of value that comes from people of color, and that we would even admit to ourselves that we've put on the black body sins like sinful, like sloth and laziness. I think that's true. Boom, drop the mic. White privilege is the privilege to hold up that meritocracy is the determining factor in the way things are, and to a large degree they are. Except when you figure how much merit has historically been built up and unexamined in white privilege. DiAngelo claims we're raised to be racially illiterate as a defense to see ourselves for who we are. That it's a neutral default in order to prevent us from examining our own good, affirming sense of selves has a destructive side. We whites have something of an unspoken desire for inoculation and isolation that keeps our efforts to be colorblind in a blissful way. There was not one thing in particular that caused myself over the last, couple months, 10 days, to change my mind. It was really a cascade of an assault of the facts. However, this historic truth stuck in my mind. Brought me to tears, actually. And it's a statistic, so there you go. Statistically, white people have remained in their homes, in their neighborhoods, not selling their houses, and even buying into an area that's about 20% black. Once it hits about 20% black consistently, historically across geographies in the United States, people stop moving in, white people stop moving in. If the neighborhood turns to being about 30% black, white people sell. Given that home ownership and the asset that we accumulate in our houses is really the chief wealth most people accumulate, and given that once black people move into a neighborhood, that asset begins to drop, it's a punishing, passive racism that's built upon a much more unexamined, active racism that's hard to argue. I'd known about white flight and declining property values before I started bathing in and breathing in the deeper truths about racism. But having been trained by my white family, I had mostly categorized this in the mental file folder, market forces. I know, or assume, that had my family, had there been a large number of African Americans moving into my neighborhood, we would have thought about selling, and that hurts. That's how racism works. And it's one thing to be a person who removes the N-word from your vocabulary and goes out of your way to be friendly to black people. It's another thing to expect yourself to have a higher moral standard, which we do. And we hold that standard for ourselves, and that means we need to address this issue while it's hot and on the table. And that probably involves reparations, and it certainly involves an active conversation about that. Amen. Our offertory is not funny today. It is simply a request that you make a donation that will be split between LA's Black Lives Matter movement, and we hope you give generously. Thanks. Amen. Thank you, Gary. So Gary's playing our piano today, stepping in for Severin. We're going to have Abraham for the next 4 weeks. And Leanne is doing our camera, who's our multiverse worship leader. Thank you to Vivian today. We're going to have 4 exciting speakers coming up. You're not going to get to or have to look at me for a month. We have next week, we have Sarah Dean, who's is a Muslim woman from the South Coast Interfaith Council, of which I'm on the board now. We have Michael Estlin, popular speaker, oncologist, chaplain, who's going to come talk about pilgrimage. We have a woman named Vanessa Gomez-Brake, who's going to come. She's the first humanist chaplain in a major university, so that's an interesting twist. And she is going to talk about young adult spirituality in the college campus and all of how that connects to what's going on politically. And then we're going to have Corey Wang, who is going to be our anniversary speaker, and she's going to come talk about the nature of love as it relates to race issues. So we're going to continue this theme, as it's important for us to be attentive to this. And then I'll be back on the 9th of August. So thanks to those, and I invite you to hold hands if you can with those who are nearby. Here are our closing words. This church is dedicated to the proposition that behind all our differences, beneath all our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together. In spite of time and death and the space between the stars, we pause in silent witness to that unity. May the blessing of love be upon you. May love's peace abide with you. May love's presence illuminate your hearts now and forevermore. So be it. Amen. Shalom. Salam. Namaste. Blessed be. And as we say at home, now our service truly begins.
I'm going to do an original song I wrote recently. You could think of this as a relationship having difficulties, or you could think of this as the time of COVID-19 and we're all having difficulties. If we go back again to ways from before, then no lessons are learned and no progress is earned. If we go back once more, can we see what we've done? Can we see what we've gained? It's so clear who we've wronged. This should not be prolonged. This must now be reframed. It's so clear what we've done wrong this far. We haven't cared what others had to feel. In our hearts we know just who we are. The times like these just make life so unreal. The longer we are apart, the more I fear you are gone. When you rush to my side with your arms open wide, then our world can move on. After all this is done, and our freedom we win, we must never fall back. We must take up the slack. Don't go back to old sins. We can't go back again to the ways we abhor. Take these lessons we've learned. Make sure progress is earned. Take our lives back once more. Take these lessons we've learned. Make sure progress is earned. Take our lives back once more.
Beautiful sentiments, Gary. That's nice. Thanks for joining us. Hope you continue to witness our services. We're talking about coming back on the 16th with the COVID numbers. We're not sure what we're going to do, to be quite honest. We're going to monitor all of that and try to enjoy as much of summer and try to reflect on, on the things going on. Let's not waste this moment. Amen.